For 125 years, the Maryland State Bar Association has served as the home of the legal profession, focused on supporting and elevating the profile of more than 40,000 legal professionals around the state. MSBA continues to serve its members and the public by connecting with important leaders around the state and talking about the issues that matter to you. I'm Pamela Wood, a politics reporter for the Baltimore Banner, and I will be co-moderating tonight's forum. Tonight we will welcome the Democratic candidates for governor to this MSBA forum. This discussion will be available to MSB members and the public via live stream tonight, and it will be available on demand. MSBA does not endorse or rank political candidates, and every candidate was given an opportunity to participate in forums with the MSBA. The MSBA sought to hold a Republican forum at this legal summit, but lack of responses or late responses from the candidates resulted in a decision to hold a recorded forum that would be streamed during the conference. But several candidates then opted out with little notice. MSBA will be seeking to host an in-person forum for all the Republican candidates at the end of this month, and all of them are welcome to attend, and details will follow. You can visit the MSBA website to access more of the discussions with candidates from all parties. And the MSBA will continue to engage with the candidates for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and others throughout the election season.
Hello, I'm Dick Iuliano, a reporter for WTOP, also co-moderating this evening. We invited all Democratic candidates to join us. Some have declined due to scheduling conflicts or COVID-related issues, but we are very glad to welcome to our stage this evening the participating candidates. First, John Barron. Doug Gansler, Rashern Baker, John King, and Jerome Siegel. Welcome. We will begin with a 90-second opening statement from each candidate, then 4 questions determined by the moderators and MSBA. Each candidate will have 1 minute to answer each question and 1 minute to answer each follow-up question. We will conclude the discussion with a 1-minute closing statement from each candidate. Before we begin, some ground rules. Tonight will be a listening-only session for the audience, not a Q&A. We ask you to please remain quiet during the session. We also ask you to hold your applause until the end of the forum. The format will allow for a better live stream experience. We ask you to please respect the forum format. And by the way, after the program, we invite all of you to join us in the lobby for a chance to mingle with the candidates. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Again, each candidate will have 1 minute and 30 to make an opening statement, and the first with an opening statement will be Jerome Siegel.
Hi. So earlier this year, the Bar Association did one-on-one interviews with almost all of the candidates. I entered the race after that and wasn't part of that, but there was one question that was asked that I care actually a great deal about. I want to use this moment to answer that question. The question was about an executive order by Governor Hogan on making it a requirement for any company to do business with the state of Maryland that they sign a pledge that they will not boycott West Bank settlements, that is, Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And, and each candidate was asked whether or not they would pledge, as it were, to maintain that. And with the exception of John King, the only person I heard who said he wouldn't, and some of the candidates were falling all over themselves committing to keep that. My answer is no. On day one, I would rip it up, not just because of the civil liberties issues, which John raised, but actually because of the substantive issues. I worked on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for 40 years. The settlements are a deliberate effort to prevent the two-state solution. Almost every American president either thought they were illegal or an obstacle, and I have no idea why people are falling all over supporting that. Not only would I rip them up, but I would require that anything made in the West Bank settlements was labeled so Maryland consumers could decide, and I'd consider having the state end our Maryland government of Israel state-to-state relationship until Israel either stops building settlements or accepts the parameters for a negotiated settlement either from Clinton or Obama or even George Bush.
Thank you, Mr. Siegel. Thank you very much. Second for an opening statement, Mr. Doug Gansler.
Thank you. And thank you to the MSBA for doing this forum. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to lawyers from throughout the state. I've been a practicing lawyer for 33 years. I'm the only practicing lawyer that's running for governor. I've worked at small firms, large firms. I've worked for the Maryland Court of Appeals. I worked as an assistant United States attorney for 6 years, doing mostly homicides, but really prosecuting all kinds of cases. I was the state's attorney for Montgomery County for 8 years, and I was your attorney general for 8 years, including being president of all the attorneys general throughout the country for a year. I've had over 200 jury trials, 54 appellate arguments, won a unanimous case in front of the Supreme Court of the United States, 9-0 to keep a sex offender in jail. Both the Chief Judge of the Court of Special Appeals and the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals worked in my office, and I hired both of them, and we have a phenomenal and wonderful bench here in Maryland. I currently am working for Cadwalader, Wickersham, and Taft, the oldest law firm in America, running the state attorney general practice, but I also have a number of False Claims Act cases. I represent the state of Vermont, for example, in a lawsuit against the fossil fuel companies around climate change. I've been to this meeting at least 12 times. I'm sorry that we're not going to be at the Clarion around the pool and the cabanas this year, but I have many friends and colleagues here. I've been to the State's Attorneys Association conference here in Ocean City 8 times when I was the state's attorney. Looking forward to being your governor, and one of the first things we're going to do is get rid of judicial elections. They're wrong. Judges should not be raising money from lawyers, and they should not be political, and we need to have diversity on our bench.
Thank you, Mr. Gansler. Next for an opening statement, Rushern Baker.
Thank you. Thank you for putting on this forum. Like many of you, I spent the last couple of years a quarantine witness to America and our states coming to grips with America's original sin, that is slavery, but also watching COVID. And I couldn't simply sit on the sidelines as somebody who has the experience being a state legislator on judiciary and appropriation and governing one of the largest jurisdictions in the state of Maryland, Prince George's County. I couldn't sit on the sidelines when Maryland should be leading on these critical issues that we face, not only in our state, but in our nation. But in order to do that, it's not simply about what you believe or what you say. It is what you can get done. And I believe that the experience that I have and that my running mate has is what we need right now. COVID has thrown this whole place apart. We need somebody who on day one can get in there and get the job done. So I will do that as governor. But it also means that you have to speak hard truths to power. We have to honestly talk about the slaughter of young black men in Baltimore City and places like that. We have to speak hard truth to power about health care and the fact that COVID has just shown us that in one of the richest states in the richest nation, people don't have health care. We have to speak hard truths about the fact that people are afraid of losing their jobs, of sending their kids to school. We've got to do that, and I'm the governor that will do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Next for an opening statement, Mr. John King.
Thanks so much. Grateful to the Bar Association for hosting this forum. My name is John King. I served as United States Secretary of Education for President Obama, and I'm running for governor because I have a deep belief in the role that public institutions can play in people's lives. I know that because public schools saved my life. When I was growing up, both my parents were educators, my mom a teacher and school counselor, my dad a teacher and administrator, but they both passed away when I was little. My mom when I was 8 and my dad when I was 12. And during the period when it was just my dad and me, my dad was struggling with Alzheimer's. Home was incredibly difficult. I didn't know what my father would be like from one night to the next, some nights angry, some nights sad. The thing that saved me was public school. Great public school teachers who made school a place that was safe and supportive and nurturing. And because of them, I had the opportunity to go on to become a teacher and a principal, to lead schools at the local level and state level before serving as Secretary of Education. responsible for a budget $15 billion bigger than the budget of the state of Maryland. But as an educator, you see how all the other systems impact kids and families, whether or not they have safe and affordable housing, whether or not they have health care, whether or not they're food insecure, whether or not parents can find a good job. And so I'm running for governor to ensure a more just, more equitable, more prosperous future for the state and for all of our kids.
Thanks, Mr. King. And now an opening statement from John Barron.
Thank you. I'm John Barron. I'm a former nonprofit executive. Before that, I headed a $1 billion technology program in the Clinton administration. I've been an appointee of Democratic and Republican presidents. I've gotten major federal legislation enacted into law that's benefited Maryland and other states. The reason I'm running for governor is that Maryland isn't making progress on major problems that damage millions of lives, and I'm offering a fundamentally different approach. In education, more than a quarter of middle school students in Maryland can't read at a basic level. Those numbers are no different than 20 years ago. Moderate income Marylanders have seen stagnant wages since the 1980s, as income inequality has soared, and our state has made no progress reducing our poverty rate in more than 30 years. Fellow Marylanders, we cannot just keep doing the same thing we've been doing for decades, rolling out one unproven government program after another and expect a different result, because unfortunately many programs, even well-meaning programs, don't work. Instead, to make progress, we need to expand solutions that have actually been tested in the real world and shown to make a big difference in people's lives. As one concrete example, when I'm governor, we will expand high-quality tutoring to every struggling first and second grader in the entire state of Maryland, because that's been shown to move them up toward grade level early before the problems get serious in later grades. We're going to do this by recruiting an army of people from the community, including retirees and recent college graduates, to become tutors for a modest stipend as a public service. That's just one example. I look forward to discussing other proven solutions that I'll bring to Maryland this evening.
Thanks, Mr. Barron. That concludes our opening statements.
And now we will get into the questions. A reminder, you'll have 1 minute to answer each of these questions as well as any follow-ups we ask. The first topic is on climate change. Now, climate change is already affecting many parts of Maryland, and it is predicted to only get worse. Please describe 3 specific actions you would like to pursue as governor here in Maryland to both prevent and mitigate the impacts of climate change. We will start first with Mr. Gansler.
Thank you. When I was the Attorney General of Maryland, it was my biggest priority was the cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay and the environment. In fact, I was the head of all the Attorneys General of the United States on that. We took on corporate polluters and got millions and millions of dollars here in Maryland and throughout the country on cases against out-of-state and in-state polluters. The 3 priorities I would suggest is we need to have offshore wind here in Ocean City. We need to have solar power in residential, commercial, and public space throughout the state. We need to put a moratorium on sprawl, particularly in the critical areas. For example, the lakeside development at Trapp at 2,600 homes does not need to happen. We're going to convert the 2 billion pounds of chicken manure that goes into the bay each year into power, a climate-neutral power here on the Eastern Shore to make sure that we promote and support our agriculture industry. We need to support our watermen as well. We need to set up the infrastructure for the electric vehicles that will come in, that the private sector is driving, as well as mass transit. The Red Line, the Purple Line, Southern Branch from Prince George's County to Charles County, reliable bus system, and Wilson Bridge Metro.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned increasing solar power on public spaces. What are your thoughts on solar power in agricultural spaces? Do you see that as valuable?
I think it is. I think we need to have solar power everywhere, on roofs of buildings, and on certainly all commercial properties. And like right here on the Eastern Shore, for example, UMES is one of our 4 historically black colleges and universities, has a vibrant and really prosperous program around solar power. So I do think we need to be able to put it on public spaces and agricultural spaces, though we need to make sure that we keep the open space on the Eastern Shore and around the state for agriculture, and hopefully solar is the sort of next best alternative.
Thank you. Next to Mr. King, what are 3 actions you would take on preventing and mitigating climate change?
I'm so glad that you asked about this because it's such an urgent issue. I think about being in Easton, meeting with a group of Democrats there, and one of the young people breaking into tears because she knows the risk that her home will be underwater if we don't take action on climate. So we need a governor who will lead on climate. That means the state needs to model best practice. It means converting the entire state fleet to electric by 2030, converting our public transit buses and our school buses to electric by 2030. It means making all of our state office buildings, our college campuses, and our schools net zero by 2030. We need to take on transportation policy, invest in public transit, build the Red Line, build the Southern Maryland Light Rail Project, expand the MARC West. We also need to grow renewable energy in the state. That means wind, that means solar, that means geothermal, but frankly, it does not mean chicken manure. I mean, that's really just a subsidy for the poultry industry. That's not a serious plan for addressing climate change.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned wind power. What is your position on offshore wind power?
It's a huge opportunity. We need to be a national leader on offshore wind. Governor Hogan has moved too slowly to implement a vision for offshore wind. It's a potential source of great jobs here on the Eastern Shore. But that won't be enough. We also have to build out solar. We have to build out geothermal. We have to do everything possible to build a thriving green economy. And the good news about that is that's going to create great jobs.
Thank you. Now, next to Mr. Barron, what actions would you pursue to prevent and mitigate climate change?
So Maryland has done well on this front. We've actually led the nation in reducing climate emissions over the past 15 years with a 38% overall reduction. One of the reasons is that we have been part of a regional initiative with 10 other states called RGGI, that all of these states, since 2009, put a legally enforceable cap on carbon emissions from power plants that reduces over time, but it lets industry determine how to meet those caps, those enforceable caps. The RGGI states together have had a 47% reduction in carbon emissions from power plants. It's an approach that has buy-in from industry. It has bipartisan support. One of my main initiatives as governor, one of my lead priorities would be to expand this highly effective approach that applies to power plants to other sectors of the economy, including transportation and building and industries. Again, the central principle is government sets the caps, they're ambitious caps, they reduce over time, industry determines how to meet those caps in the most cost-effective manner.
In addition to expanding cap and trade on emissions, what are other policies you would pursue?
I would take a similar approach, a flexible approach, with regard to procurement. So when state government procures buildings and vehicles, we should be pushing the frontier on technologies and clean technologies in the purchase. However, different from other candidates, we should be technology neutral, meaning we should set the performance standards for reduced emissions, but let industry and others determine how to get there in the most cost-effective ways, depending on technology and market conditions.
All right, thank you. Next up is Mr. Siegel. What are 3 actions you would take on climate change?
Let me take the analogy of the Green New Deal, okay? What the Green New Deal was a decision to approach the problem of climate change through the ideals of the New Deal, through a lens, basically a social justice lens. I'm running as a bread and roses socialist, and I take the same approach, except it's not the New Deal, it's bread and roses socialism. And a central thing that we're trying to do in bread and roses socialism basically is to put time back on the agenda, to go not just to the 5-day work which we got in the 30s, but the 4-day and ultimately the 3-day work week. It dovetails perfectly with the transportation sector. Right now, transportation takes up 20% of the household budget, which basically is 1 day of work a week. We can knock that down from 20% to 5% by going to a near-free electric vehicle, which General Motors is making in China for $4,500 as opposed to the $60,000 Tesla, which is the best-selling one. So we want to move basically to electric vehicles that are near free, and we can actually start your weekend on that saving at 10:30 on Friday morning.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure I understand how that would address the problem of climate change. Can you please
Whoa,
offer
well,
specifics on how
Yes, CO2 emissions are the single biggest source of global warming. We've got to move to electric vehicles. The question is how? And it's whether or not poor people are going to get to electric vehicles when they become old used cars, because we're waiting for 60,000 Teslas to get down to 10,000, or we're going to start out right now with new electric vehicles that'll be highly subsidized and for people with low income, and they'll be the first ones to be driving it, and they won't be spending 20% of their budget on transportation, because it's all automobile at 20%. We can knock it down to 5% and save them 15% of the household budget.
Thank you. And last, Mr. Baker, can you please describe your policy proposals for climate change?
Well, first of all, I think a lot of the things that have been said. I certainly, one of the things that I didn't hear was fossil fuel infrastructure. I would not do that. We should move toward natural gas. But the other things around climate, a very important part that we're forgetting when we talk about it at the state level is, one, getting a Secretary of the Environment and letting that person actually do their job. You know, we had a very good bill that was put through this legislative session by Senator Penske, but it was cut back because of the corporate interest that weighed in. But getting a secretary that actually does their job and letting them do their job. And the other is at the local level. Many of these decisions are really impacted at the local level. I know this because I created a Department of the Environment when I was county executive, so we could actually do infrastructure where transportation around where we actually had infrastructure, that we could do stormwater management and lead the state in that area, recycling, working with them on these policy issues.
Thank you. Can you please describe more how that cooperation, it sounds like, between the governor and the locals would attack the issue of climate change?
So the way it attacks the issue of the cooperation is that what we had when we had worked with the O'Malley administration is that we had an agreement that if we built around existing transportation, where the metro is, that the state would come in and incentivize that building. The same thing when we were doing our stormwater management. We worked with the state to do that, to lead in those efforts. And so I think working together, because those zoning decisions are going to be made at the local level, and so we have to work together on that.
Thank you.
Our second question this evening is about cameras in the courtroom. Maryland's courtrooms are currently closed to cameras and recording devices, with a few exceptions. Now, the pandemic has shown improved capabilities and technology for remote access. Do you favor allowing recording either for the news media or the public? And if so, how would you like to see this changed? And the first to answer that question, we ask Rusher and Baker.
Why did I know I was going to get that question first? You know what, I'll be honest, I go back and forth on it. I started my career on judiciary, and I was against cameras in courtroom. I didn't find them, but as I've gotten older, I think, I still worry about it. I just saw the trial going on with some actors, and everybody's all into that. And I just worry about whether, in fact, if people were playing to the camera. And so I guess my answer would be I'd move toward cameras in the courtroom, but I do it cautiously.
Well, if you were governor, how would you work this out with the different branch of the government, the judiciary? How would you see your way through on this?
Well, so I would do like I did when I was an executive, and that is to sit down with the judiciary and work out, a study on this, so that we come up with something that's balanced for both, our moving forward. So I would sit down with the judiciary and work it out.
John Barron, how about cameras in the courtroom, either for the news media or the public?
Well, there are balancing concerns here. One of them is free press, which I think is probably something you guys are in favor of. All of us are in favor of it. Making information available to the public. The other is you really want to make sure that justice is done and it's not tainted, that the juries are not tainted and so on. I guess my general thought in terms of balancing that would be to leave it up to the individual judge.
You talk about the free press, certainly, and the importance of information to the public, and you're right, we are for that. How would you balance the concerns of, for example, victims' families in criminal cases and so forth?
I think just like we give judges discretion in so many other areas, it should be up to the judge, basically, to make the determination based on, I mean, each case is going to be individual, whether there is a possibility of a real problem, with the victims' families, whether it could cause, severe repercussions, balancing that against the right to, free speech concerns. I think the judge is probably in the best position to make that determination based on the individual case before them.
Mr. Siegel, Jerome Siegel, cameras in the courtroom.
Yes, I'm in favor of it. Look, I was told when in preparation for this forum that access to the courtroom was a topic, and I tried to figure out what that meant, and I was told just access to the courtroom. So I started to think about it, and the question in my mind was, is this going to be an inside baseball question, or is this really going to be about the problem in America of people having access to the courts? So I thought about, what do I really believe? And there's a big problem of access to the court system. And basically, it's an educational one. People don't know what their rights are. They don't know how the legal system works, right? I think we should have legal education, something that you learn in law school, be part of elementary education from day one. People should know, what's the difference between a civil and criminal? Can you represent yourself? What is the Constitution? What are your rights? All of these questions need to be part of education to preserve and enrich a democracy, which goes to one other point, which is what's wrong with the blueprint, right? The blueprint has this, for education that's now part of law, right, has the narrowest conception of the missions of the schools and acquainting people so that they have access and understanding of our own system is a central mission of the schools.
Well, as you educate people more about the legal system, do you think that news media covering criminal cases, sentencing procedures, would this help if cameras were in the courtroom?
I think it's very important. I go back to the model of ancient Athens. They had juries in Athens that had 500 people on the juries. People were participating in the courts and the legal system day in and day out. It was a thriving democracy of the sort that we've never gotten. And I think starting with cameras is an important start for engaging people really in all the struggles in our society. It's great education.
John King, what is your view on cameras in the courtroom?
I'd be open to a pilot with cameras in the courtroom worked out together with the judicial branch, but I'd want to be very careful about the protection of victims. I'd want to be very careful about the protection of witnesses whose safety might be in danger if they were exposed. I want to be very careful about children who are sometimes present in the courtroom, and we'd have to think carefully about their role as witnesses, or if this is a matter of youth justice, how we would deal with that. So I'd want to be very careful that we were prioritizing the public good, but again, I'd be open to a pilot.
Well, in the process of being careful and offering those protections, what's your level of concern that if you didn't have the cameras, then you're not really operating the courts in full view of the public, which is really a fundamental part of the justice system?
Yeah, and that's the potential benefit of the pilot. And I think we have seen in other states times, I think about some of the trials of police officers who were involved in misconduct against citizens, even the murder of innocent African-American unarmed men, and the public benefit of having those trials be transparent. So there is merit, but I'd want to proceed cautiously because of the risks.
Doug Gansler, cameras in the courtroom.
Yeah, as the only one, again, experience matters. As somebody who's prosecuted more than 200 trials, I can tell you that I have no problem with cameras in the courtroom, but I also would want to give, and there's no pilot needed, it's done around the country, but I would want to give judges discretion, as Mr. King brought up, to some of the cases that are more sensitive, domestic violence cases, I started the first domestic violence docket in Maryland's history. I would not want to have cameras in those courtrooms. I would think that would be part of it. But the presumption ought to be that we do have transparency and that we have as much transparency as possible. For example, one of the things I did when I was a prosecutor was I had, for a number of cases, allowed the jurors to ask questions of the witnesses because they would want to know the answer to some of the questions. And that's the kind of thing we ought to be thinking about. We have great judges here in Maryland, but we need to make sure that we have a Democrat that gets elected, because right now 6 out of the 7 judges on the Court of Appeals are Republicans. We have major issues coming up like reproductive rights, and choice is going to be on the ballot.
I know you're a former state's attorney, and state's attorneys often are very careful about protecting family members of victims. What are the safeguards, particularly in murder cases and criminal cases?
Yeah, so I actually argued the first victim rights case in front of the D.C. Court of Appeals, and I'm a victim's right advocate, always have been, and so that's why the judges need to have the discretion to not, first of all, ever have the jury on camera because of harassment issues and so forth, but also sensitized cases, and victims should not be on there unless they want to be.
Thank you.
All right, our next question. Voters this fall in Maryland on the general election ballot will face a choice of legalizing marijuana for adult recreational use. I'd like to ask you each how you plan to vote on that question and how you got to that decision. We'll start with Mr. King.
Sure. Well, I'm very much in support of the legalization of cannabis, and I will certainly vote in support. That said, I think there are some critical things that we need to do in implementing once that is approved. We've got to make sure that we expunge the records of those who have criminal convictions tied to cannabis. We've got to make sure that the industry that emerges is one in which communities that were most directly impacted by the war on drugs have an opportunity to participate. Sadly, when we look at other states that have implemented cannabis legalization, large multi-state corporations have come in and dominated the whole industry, and it hasn't turned into economic opportunity for the communities directly impacted. I also would like us to pursue what Senator Carter proposed, which is ensuring that a majority of the revenues that come from cannabis legalization are redirected to those communities that have been most negatively impacted by the war on drugs. Addiction treatment, reentry services, those kinds of supports in those communities.
So you mentioned about having participation in the industry by impacted communities. In Maryland, we already have a group of licensees through the medical program. Would you favor giving them a first shot or any kind of advantage? How would you account for them in a new licensing process?
Unfortunately, we've seen actually problems in the medical marijuana sector where large corporations have had an advantage over small businesses owned by people of color. So I think we need to have a system that models the best states that have been most successful in a diverse industry.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Gansler, how do you plan to vote and why?
Well, I was the first candidate to come out in support of legalizing cannabis, so I obviously would vote in favor of it. And I don't, this is obviously an issue that is very important for a lot of communities, and it disproportionately affects communities of color, and actually crime disproportionately affects communities of color, and we have to be cognizant of that. I started the first drug courts in Maryland's history, and we started the first drug court and then the second, and we put too many people in jail as it is right now, and we have to give people an opportunity to not live in a cage and to be productive members of society. So I personally prosecuted for 6 months in a drug court every day, and I would like to see all 24 jurisdictions in Maryland have drug courts and domestic violence courts, as well as family justice centers, which I also started in Montgomery County, because I think that is critical to making sure that we don't incarcerate low-level offenders, particularly people that have a public health addiction, and that we certainly prioritize gun crimes and violent offenders.
Now, Mr. Gansler, you mentioned people who are caught up in the legal system because of drug use. Certainly there's a lot of people, should this be legalized, they have possession on their records. How would you handle those people who have prior offenses for marijuana possession?
They should be automatically expunged.
So no application process, it should be automatically done?
Possession of marijuana should be automatically expunged.
Great, thank you. Next, Mr. Baker, how do you plan to vote on the referendum and why?
No, I plan to vote in favor of the referendum. And it came to this not just as an executive, but as a member of judiciary, watching a number of people who were getting convictions and on their record, especially young and mostly African American and Latino kids who were doing that, who now were prevented from going to college, renting a house, getting a job. And then as county executive, I really saw it, not only through the victims, but also our police department spending time arresting young people who were using adult use cannabis. We decriminalized it. I was in favor of that. But I think, to get to Mr. King's point, I think what we need to do is, as we have this initiative on the ballot, we should start right now making the legislation possible to deal with expungement, to deal with how we're going to actually award these contracts, and to talk about how we actually use some of those funds, especially back in Baltimore City when we saw an over-arrest in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, how we use those monies there.
Thank you. And how would you assure equity for affected communities in the licensing process?
I think you have to, if you don't do it right now before it's passed, then it's too late. So we know that there's a good chance that this legislation is going to pass. So we should have, the legislature and the governor should be working on equity. That's what the problem was when we had medical marijuana use. The first bill that was put in for medical marijuana use, I signed on to. That was in 1994. So we knew eventually it would come to this. We should have started thinking about how we would award those contracts, how we would deal with expungement, how we would deal with all of those things. As governor, I would start working on that right now, and I call on the legislature to do that right now.
Thank you. And Mr. Barron, how do you plan to vote on the marijuana referendum and why?
I plan to vote yes, because the current system where it is criminalized has resulted in people having criminal records and incarcerated and being involved in the justice system that is not warranted. There's no principled reason why why cannabis use is that much different from, say, alcohol use, which has been legal for almost a century. Here's one thing I would do differently. With the revenues, I would use some of those revenues, a substantial portion, to fund substance abuse prevention programs that have been tested and found to be highly effective in preventing abuse of alcohol, of marijuana, of illicit drugs abuse. So there's one example. My foundation, my philanthropic team expanded. It's called Life Skills Training. It's a middle school program that teaches social skills and drug refusal skills. It's been shown to reduce long-term abuse problems by 20%. It's a low-cost program. We should be funding and doing this throughout the state of Maryland.
What do you see, should this pass, what do you see as the biggest challenges towards implementing legalized marijuana?
Well, a lot of it is figuring out the details. The expungement issue, I also support expungement of past records. How do you allocate the licenses? I agree with what others have said. We need to do it in a way that is open and allows and make sure we have participation of minority businesses and women-owned businesses in the process, and that it's a fair process that doesn't reward people who know companies that know all of the arcane details of government licensing and procurement. So a lot of those details would need to be worked out. But again, a key piece is the real problem in our state is abuse of illicit drugs, and we can use some of the revenues to address that. Maryland has the 7th highest overdose death rate in the nation. It's a real problem.
Thank you. And to you, Mr. Siegel, how do you plan to vote on the marijuana referendum?
Yeah, I'm all for decriminalizing, and I think it's a kind of a no-brainer. It seems to me that the experience that we had with it is in its own way a repeat of prohibition, in that the problems that criminalizing it produced are devastating. The big issue really is do we go beyond marijuana to much more serious drugs? And the person I've been listening to, and I think he's quite intelligent, is David Lasher, the libertarian candidate, who's talking about the only serious way to deal with crime in Maryland is to legalize hard drugs. And I was trying to think about, well, I'm not sure about that, but how does Bread and Roses think about it? And our approach actually is not so much to focus on the pathologies of our system in terms of patching things up, but to try to think about the structures that are creating that. So why do people go to drugs? And I think people go to drugs because there's nothing vital happening in their lives. And what we're about, when I talk about putting time back on the agenda, we're not about overthrowing capitalism. We're about shrinking it to 3 days in the job system and 4 days in which people are absorbed in passion work, whatever that is, but something that is genuinely their own. And that
Thank
should be
you.
part of their education.
I wanted to follow up on a point you mentioned. You brought up the idea of legalizing drugs beyond marijuana, narcotics, and other hard drugs. Is that something you would favor as governor?
I have mixed feelings about it. I underwent major surgery for pancreatic cancer, and I was put on Oxycontin by Hopkins, right? And I'll tell you, for 6 months, I couldn't think straight and didn't know that I couldn't think straight. So I have an experience of what it is actually, and that was just from like 2 or 3 days in the hospital in terms of basically how powerful these drugs are, and you basically lose your autonomy. You lose the ability to rationally assess anything in your life, and you don't know that it's happening to you. So I'm very cautious about that. What I'm really concerned about is why do people voluntarily go to serious drugs, and that's because there's something more fundamental that's wrong with our society, right? And some people have talked about it as, well, it's capitalism. But it is about alienated work. It's about selling your labor to others who define what you're going to do rather than finding your true passions. And what we're about, basically, is we'll keep that system, but 3 days a week. That's shrinking it.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to turn to the issue of gun violence. And as we all know, gun violence, it continues to harm our communities. Most recently, we had 10 people killed at the supermarket in Buffalo, and then quickly followed by this horrific attack in Uvalde, Texas, where a gunman killed 19 children and 2 teachers. And certainly, you know, while the crime rate has come down largely in many places, violent crime is up in places like Baltimore City, Prince George's County, and other places. Please describe 3 strategies that you would support as governor to reduce gun violence. And we'll begin with John Barron.
Thank you. So, first piece is that we really need federal legislation in this area because Maryland actually has very good gun laws, assault weapons ban, background checks, red flag laws, and so on. But guns cross state lines. And so this really is a national issue, and I'm hoping that something happens federally. But in the meantime, there's something very concrete that we can do in Maryland that would make a major difference in the area of safe gun storage. Now, there's been analyses have found that most of the school shootings over the past 20 years, not in Uvalde, but most of the others, have been carried out by youth who got a hold of their parents' or relatives' guns that were not secured. Maryland should take a lead here, as Massachusetts and Oregon have done, and require gun owners, when they're not actually using the gun, require that the gun be stored and locked. That would make a major difference. Wouldn't prevent everything, but it's a concrete step that would prevent a lot of school shootings.
Is that something that you would put forward if you were governor?
Yes.
And you see that as having a mitigating effect on gun violence, just if they were stored better? I mean, there seems to be such a proliferation of guns. You think that that would solve?
Well, one of the problems, it would address a number of things. Number one, kids getting a hold of guns potentially for school shootings or suicide. I mean, we have had an epidemic of suicides in the state and the country, but in Maryland alone over the past 15 years, we've had a 25% increase in suicides. Most of them are carried out with firearms. A lot of this is preventable by requiring, there was also incidentally a study in Alaska that showed that when gun lockers are provided and required, they're actually used. So it does actually change behavior and result in gun storage. So this is a concrete step that would really make a big difference, and as governor, I would take a lead on it.
3 strategies to reduce gun violence. Rushern Baker.
Well, this is something I've had to deal with when I was county executive, because we did see our homicide rates going up. And I remember, having worked on judiciary and passed some of the gun laws when I was there. The first thing our police chief came to me and said, we want to do a gun buyback program. And I thought he was nuts, until we actually looked at how many guns were out there that had committed crimes. So what I came to the conclusion is we have to get guns off the street. That's one of the ways we're going to find it. We have to go after it. This whole notion of maybe doing a gun court, I think is something we should look at. The other thing is mental and behavioral health. A lot of the folks who are answering these problems with guns, you have to invest in it. But it's going to take the governor and the local jurisdiction to work together, because it is at the local jurisdiction where the police chief or commissioner is assigned, but it's also where they are interacting with with this. So we had a gun task force when I was county executive that did many of the things I'm talking about, especially getting guns off the street.
Mr. Baker, the gun buyback programs, don't they tend to draw in guns that, someone has an old rusty gun in the back of the closet, and these are not really the guns that are used in crime?
I have to say they do. They tend to get a majority of those, but they also tended to get guns that were committed in crimes. And so what the police chief said to me, and I have to, in the task force, they said, we want to get any gun off the street. Old guns that can be refashioned to commit a crime, we want to get them all off the street. So if this is in combination to what we're already doing with our task force, seizing these these folks who traffic in guns, we want to use every tool that we can. And I think we as a state should do that. And it's worked. We saw our numbers go down. It wasn't just a buyback, but it was in combination of our gun task force that went after folks who were illegally selling guns on the black market, or people who were out there with guns. But it actually did work.
Jerome Siegel, do you have 3 strategies for reducing gun violence?
Yeah. Let me. I'll mention a few things, but let me preface it by saying there's only so much you can do with respect to these programs. The issue of gun violence is a deep cultural issue, and there's something wrong with America. There's something deeply wrong with America in terms of violence, and it starts very, very young. I grew up in a fairly rough neighborhood in my early years in the Bronx, and let me tell you, by the time you're 3 years old, you know something about the street culture. You know how things are settled, you know who's dangerous, you know who to steer away from, and your parents know nothing about it. You never talk to them about it, they don't have a clue as to what's going on. So in terms of specific things, yes, I would prevent access to guns, not at least until people are age 21 rather than 18. There's an awful lot of craziness that happens in those years while the brain is still developing. This targeting policing, where you focus on a very small group of people who are very, very likely to commit most of the stranger-to-stranger violent crimes, and that's been shown to be successful. But the big thing you really got to go after is the culture. We've got to teach really modes of conflict resolution at the very earliest ages. I have one proposal that I'll mention, which is actually...
Let's, as a follow-up, you're talking about getting it to the cultural issue. How would you attack that cultural issue?
Yeah, well, one of the things actually is just to take people out of their present environment and give them a sample of a different culture to be in. And one way in which that happened to me growing up, and it was wonderful actually, which is that I spent a sixth of the year in a totally different culture. It was in the summertime. 2 months of the summertime, I went from the Bronx to what was actually a socialist community in Putnam Valley, about 40 miles north. And there was no violence there. There was no violence there between the kids, and it was totally different. And those friendships lasted throughout the year, and they lasted our entire lifetime. So you can actually do amazing things by giving people a sample of a different, qualitatively superior way of living. And so I would do that, and I proposed it actually as one of 3 things I call Camp David initiatives, and this one would be called Camp David Day Camp, and we do it throughout the Frederick County, but we could basically take every kid from Baltimore and have them have 2 months of sleepaway camp.
Thank you. Let's see, I believe Doug Gatzler, 3 strategies for reducing gun violence.
Among many strategies, three that I would highlight would be providing a licensed mental health professional for every 250 students throughout the state of Maryland, because so many of these cases are really predicated upon young people with mental health issues as well as adults. Part of the mental health program will also be to make sure that all first responders have access, police, firefighters, and others have access to licensed mental health professionals. The second would be SROs, school resource officers. We need to have school resource officers in every school in Maryland to keep our kids safe. People don't want to drop their students off and think they may not be safe. It also has many other corollary benefits. For example, not pipelining young people into the criminal justice system. When there's an SRO, you and I are old enough to remember Officer Friendly. That's sort of the concept here, where the officers work with the administrators at the school, with the parents, with the students, to deal with criminal issues in the school, and obviously violent cases you send over. And the third would be to convicted felons with carrying a gun and committing crime of violence. Those cases should be transported to the U.S. Attorney's Office, where there's a 5-year mandatory minimum, because those are precisely the people that need to be off the streets.
What's your level of concern about returning police officers into schools? There are those who say that this has a harmful impact, particularly on students of color. And this, you talked about the harm of the pipeline to prison. Some people believe that that contributes to that.
Well, they're wrong. And one of the good things about being actually in this business for 22 years is that I've dealt with these cases. I've personally prosecuted gun cases. I personally prosecuted Terrence Green, who shot at Kyle Ollinger, a police officer, at point blank range. Right now in Baltimore, a police officer recently has been assassinated. Another police officer was carjacked. So we need to make sure we get these guns off the streets. The SROs actually reduce the amount of people of color that go into the criminal justice system, and that is how it actually works in real life.
John King, strategies for reducing gun violence.
Look, having had the horrific experience as a teacher and principal of sitting in the living room with a mom who just lost a son to gun violence, I take this issue very seriously. We can't go back to the policies of the 90s, and that's what we're hearing from Governor Hogan and others. Just send more police, just incarcerate people for longer. We have decades of evidence that does not work. What would work? 3 things. One is focusing police on stopping the flow of illegal guns and investigating violent crimes. To do that, you need to invest much more in mental health services and addiction treatment so that the police can be focused on violent crime. Second, we need to invest in violence prevention, violence interruption programs like Safe Streets that are proven to work and reduce violence, interrupt the cycle of violence. And third, we need reentry programs. 95% of the folks who are incarcerated are coming home. If we don't make sure they get education and job training while incarcerated and support finding a job and housing when they come home, they end up right back in the things that got them incarcerated in the first place. We've got to do a much better job.
One of the things we hear about gun violence is that it tends to be limited to a certain number of individuals. So why would it not make sense to use, for example, the federal statute for repeat offenders to bring them into federal court and remove them for 5 years from the streets?
Because we know that it is a concentrated number of people who tend to be involved in gun crimes, we should be surging resources to address those folks. What we've seen around the country is evidence that when programs are created that provide jobs, behavioral therapy for those who are most at risk of being involved in gun violence, we can actually reduce gun violence. And there are examples of that in city after city. I also have to take a moment to say, I have to say Doug is misrepresenting the evidence on SROs. The evidence is very clear that the presence of SROs increases the likelihood. This is armed police officers. Their presence in a school increases the likelihood that young people will be fed into the school to prison pipeline. I could have been one of those young people. Having experienced trauma as a kid, I got in a lot of trouble in high school. I got kicked out of high school. It would have been very easy for me to be fed into the school to prison pipeline. Fortunately, there were school counselors and teachers who intervened in my life. There can be school security staff, but there need to be school counselors. There need to be mental health services in schools. We don't need more armed police officers in schools.
Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, we are to closing statements. You will each have 1 minute to make your final remarks. We will start with Mr. Gansler.
This is going to be the biggest Republican year of our lifetime in terms of the election coming up, and we need to have a Democratic nominee who can actually win the general election. This is not a job for the inexperienced. Governors should not be a starter job. Candace Hollingsworth and I are the only candidates that have executive experience in the race. We need to bring crime is our #1 issue. We need to bring crime down while bringing justice up. We need to focus on the environment. I've led during times of crisis. I led during the Beltway snipers and with the Joint Sniper Task Force with 1,400 people. We brought them to justice. We need to make Baltimore safe, for example, where 400 people are slaughtered a year and people are afraid to sit at the red light because they're going to get carjacked. We need to make sure we rebuild our economy after COVID. When I was president of all the attorneys general, we had the national mortgage foreclosure crisis. We brought $2 billion into Maryland to fight the big banks on that issue. And I led the statewide effort in terms of marriage equality. In fact, the Republicans tried to impeach me for my opinion. Reproductive rights is going to be that kind of an issue that's going to be on the ballot this fall. We need a Democrat to make sure we win.
Thank you. Mr. Siegel, 1 minute for your closing remarks.
Yeah. So I'm a philosopher and a social theorist. I'm the author of 7 books. But I spent a great deal of my life in government. I worked on Capitol Hill. I was on the staff of the House Budget Committee. I worked in the executive branch. I was the actually senior advisor for agency planning in the Agency for International Development. I lectured on development studies to foreign service officers, and then I spent 25 years at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. I developed basically a new political outlook. I'd call it an ideology, except that it's a scary word in America. I call it bread and roses socialism, sometimes bread and roses humanism. In many ways, it combines simple living and beauty with a policy agenda for getting there. We're talking about a new social contract, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs, that moves away from the market determination of what amount of goods and services do you have. It's a model much more on the model of a family. Different society. Can't explain it in these 90-second things, but it's on my website, siegelforgovernor.org, and it's on breadandroses.us.
Thank you. We'll move forward. Mr. King, your final thoughts.
You know, there are folks who say that the Democratic candidates are all the same. We are not. I've put forward an ambitious set of proposals that some people would say are long shot, that it's a long shot to have world-class schools in every part of the state, that it's a long shot to get Maryland to be one of the first states to be net zero greenhouse gas emissions, that it's a long shot to treat healthcare and housing as human rights, that it's a long shot to make Maryland a North Star for reproductive rights. And to those people, I would say, my whole life story is a long shot, and my family's story is a long shot. I live in Silver Spring, Maryland, about 25 miles from where my great-grandfather was enslaved in Gaithersburg, Maryland. That cabin that he lived in with his family as enslaved people, still standing on the property. I've been able to stand inside of that cabin. So many of our challenges today are tied to that history of slavery, of segregation, of redlining. But it is also true that in my family, we went in 3 generations from enslaved in that cabin to serving in the cabinet of the first black president. Ambition is possible, hope is possible, and that's what our campaign is about. I hope folks will support us.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, your closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you for having this forum this evening. You know, it is time for Democrats to stop apologizing for being Democrats. We're the party that hopes for the best and works for it. That's something DeVal Patrick said, and I believe it. I believe Maryland should be a leader, a national leader. We have an urgent communal responsibility to solve the biggest problems that we face in this state and in this nation. But we can't do it if we're not willing to talk truth to power. If we're not willing to talk about where we are in our K through 12, or as I call it, our K through 14 education system, and how far behind we are, and how much work we're going to have to do, and Curran is not going to solve it alone. We're not going to do it unless we talk about criminal justice in a real way. Crime in Baltimore City, Prince George's County, Western Maryland, across. How do we actually work together to solve those issues? We're not going to solve these problems unless we're willing to talk about health care and the fact that we have many who don't have it. As governor, I will do that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Barron, your closing remarks.
All of the candidates here, we share similar goals. We want to improve education and wages and racial and social equity. But the approach of the other candidates to achieving those goals misses a fundamental point, which is that many government programs, even well-meaning programs, just don't work. They don't improve people's lives, and that is true in areas that have been discussed tonight, including reentry programs, violence interruption, and some other areas. So their plans to just roll out one unproven or expand one unproven government program after another is not going to bring progress. That's what we've been doing, Democrats and Republicans, for decades. 20 years from now, will our children look back at this time and say that we faced all of these persistent problems? Stagnant student achievement, stagnant wages, stagnant poverty levels, substance abuse, opioid and suicide, and we just kept doing the same thing again and again? Or will they look back and say, in this moment, Maryland did something extraordinary, we led the nation, we pioneered a new governing approach based on solutions that are actually tested and shown to make a big difference in people's lives? That's the future I want for Maryland.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us this evening with the Maryland State Bar Association. We hope this opportunity has given voters and our colleagues in the legal profession an opportunity to learn candidates' positions and make informed decisions on the most pressing issues facing Maryland and the legal profession. We thank the candidates for joining this forum, and we look forward to engaging with them in the lobby. Let's have a round of applause for our participants.